So, in a couple of hours, people who've joined us for the 3 days will be going back to their normal life. Somebody said to me, Ajahn, you called this retreat the 5 spiritual powers that lead to the deathless. And have you addressed these yet? This person asked. And actually I have been talking about these things, not as one talk, but as themes. If you recall, just as a little synopsis now, if you recall when we were taking refuge, we were exploring what is Buddha, who was Buddha, what were the conditions that gave rise to a Buddha, what are the qualities of Buddha, and then, as importantly, recognizing that Lord Buddha demonstrated our potential. And so understanding that the refuge in Buddha is refuge in nature, ultimate nature, and your ultimate nature, and kind of affirming that at the heart of your experience is this extraordinary potential. So the first of the spiritual powers is faith. And then faith, when it's in the right place, is an extremely powerful and useful energy. So Lord Buddha says about these, the 5 powers, actually they're faculties. So they come up in the 37 Wings to Awakening as 2 separate lists. The first is listed as the 5 faculties, and then the second time it's listed as the 5 powers. How I understand this is that these faculties exist in our minds. We have a faculty of faith. And so if you don't have faith in Buddha, you'll find they have faith in something, or they put their faith in something, and sometimes that faith is skillful, sometimes it's unskillful, sometimes it's wise, sometimes it's unwise. You see a lot of young people these days, if they don't have a spiritual worldview, or if they don't have a spiritual mentor, if they haven't met spiritual practitioners with integrity, you see how devoted they can become to singers and actors, and plaster the wall with the pictures of movie stars, and listen to every silly thing that they say on their Twitter account. You see people have a loving devotion to celebrities. And so in a way, for many people, celebrities have become the deities of the modern world. And unfortunately we see so often celebrities falling from grace, having great difficulties in their own lives, so in many respects they're not very sound role models, perhaps some occasional exceptions. But when you have faith in Buddha, place your faith in Buddhahood, Lord Buddha, the qualities of a Buddha, and then you recognize that that's your potential, Buddha nature, sometimes called. The fact of having a mind which is affected by greed, hatred and delusion, the very fact that we start with that, if that's the starting point, mind can be purified. So this is a cause for optimism. And it also makes it clear what our work is, the teachings of all Buddhas. Do good, avoid harm, purify the mind. So the doing good and the avoiding harm, this is a very important part of purifying the mind, weakening the power of greed, weakening the power of hatred, putting it within a container. That's how ethical precepts, practicing patient endurance. And in a way this is like nurturing that potential. And if we allow coarse forms of greed, coarse forms of hatred to take root and grow, find expression in our speech and in our actions, then that mind is not being purified. That mind is being defiled. So we understand that the ethical training is to support your potential, to allow it to shine through. And I often talk, when talking about Sila, Ajahn Anan explains that when you keep these precepts, you don't break these rules. It's not just the case that you refrain from unskillful things, what occurs is virtue is a palpable quality that then resides in your heart. So you become, I don't like the word morality myself, but I love the word virtue, and I like the word ethical responsibility, ethical conduct, ethical standard. So because we maintain an ethical standard, we have ethics, what happens is your virtue is able to blossom, and you become a person imbued with, possessed of virtue. It's a very beautiful quality, and when you keep these precepts long enough, you can feel this goodness, inner worth, inner value. And when you break the precepts, you can feel that you harmed something, and there's a healthy sense of remorse. You want to take care of your goodness, and so faith in your Buddha nature, your Buddha potential, then you have to nurture that. Work in accordance with the laws of nature so that your nature can blossom, shine, grow in these beautiful ways. So I was affirming that on the very first day. Faith in Buddha's liberation is also faith in your potential. And we were talking about the fact that as a bodhisattva, even before he was a bodhisattva, he started just the same as us. Basically, the starting point of any Buddha is an ordinary mind which is affected by greed, hatred and delusion. Because of incredible sincerity, a great deal of effort and determination over a very long period of time, the Buddha becomes a bodhisattva, and then a great bodhisattva. At a certain point, he meets a Buddha, and he becomes so inspired. But even before meeting that Buddha, this being has exceptional compassion, aspiration, altruism, to wanting to help many beings, to be free from suffering. But at some point, the bodhisattva meets a Buddha, he's so inspired by the Buddha, he makes a lot of offerings and then makes a vow, due to this merit, may I be a Buddha also. And then he receives a prediction, a confirmation, and that Buddha then is able to say, through the power of that merit and also through the power of that Buddha's mind, is able to see the future eon where that being will become a Buddha. And so after that point, spending incredible amount of time working on the perfections, the paramis. So when we consider that, we can all feel grateful. I was even encouraging feelings of awe for the extraordinary millions of acts of kindness, millions of acts of renunciation, millions of acts of restraint, thousands and thousands of lives of contemplation and meditation, listening to Dhamma, perfecting the wisdom barami, the sila barami, the metta barami. It's incredible. But in terms of our Buddha potential or our Buddha nature, we don't have to develop all of those qualities to that same degree. When we look at Lord Buddha's teaching, there is this path, dana, sila, pavana, the Eightfold Path. We are generous, warm-hearted, good-hearted, and then ethical. And then we practice our meditation and develop our mindfulness. So this is faith, it's putting it in the right place, understanding the true refuge is ultimate nature, and the only way you realize your ultimate nature, the only way you get liberated from delusion that obscures ultimate nature, is through practicing the threefold training. So we have then faith in the path, faith in the ultimate truth, faith in ultimate nature, and faith in a path that is, sometimes you use the phrase, living in accordance with, practicing Dhamma in accordance with Dhamma. So you have to walk the path so that you can realize Dhamma. So you might have a lot of study, you might have a lot of knowledge, you might listen to a lot of Dhamma talks, but if you still can't get it together to keep the precepts and have a daily meditation practice, you're not going to realize it. The thickness of the kilesa will obscure insight. But if you do practice correctly, in accordance with Dhamma, the kilesa get thinner and thinner, and the mindfulness gets stronger. Wisdom gets sharper, and then you do have penetrative insight, and the insight literally weakens and then finally uproots and destroys the roots of the kilesa, and then that's how a mind is purified. But it is a gradual process. So understanding what we have faith in, and then really making a lot of that faith, giving rise to that faith and taking care of your faith. And so there's finding ways to express it. So we've been doing the morning and evening chanting. I always light candles. We've got some nice flowers. We offer fragrances. These are ways that we express our faith and our gratitude. Bowing, these kinds of things. It's faith, and then energy, and then sati. So what I've been emphasizing as well is the consistency of the mindfulness, placing it on the breath, coming back to the breath, being aware of thoughts as thoughts, not picking up the thoughts, not following on the thoughts. So this has been the emphasis on the mindfulness, which will continue for those who are continuing on in the retreat. And so what I think you will have noticed is that in the very act of restraining the mind in a skillful way, and coming back to the breath again and again and again, not following on with the thoughts, not picking up the thoughts about the past, and gently coming back, and not letting the mind go off into the future, and not thinking about a situation at home, a situation at work, and just saying, deal with that later. And what happens is energy builds up in the mind. So you've got sattha, faith, virya, energy, sati, mindfulness. So I wasn't placing emphasis on energy. I was encouraging you to practice in a way, and I think what you'll notice now, you've already done 15 sitting meditation sessions and a good number of walking meditation sessions, so even just within 3 days of practice, I think that people will be able to feel that there's more energy in the mind, and that would manifest as a feeling, a palpable sense of presence, a sense of clarity, more of a sense of space around your thoughts, around your feelings. And then because of that, then we come to the next one, samadhi. So samadhi, I like to call it right collectedness. Samma samadhi is right collectedness. So modern people have a debilitating habit of not recognizing the samadhi that they have, wanting more, and not noticing. And I really like the way my teacher Ajahn Anan talks about samadhi, because he doesn't just talk about jhana and the jhanas as being samadhi. Basically, khanika samadhi is when the mind is peaceful for a couple of minutes, and upajjhara samadhi is when the mind is peaceful for longer periods, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And basically this is all samadhi. And so in appreciating the samadhi that you have, and in inclining the mind to rest with its collectedness, that's exactly what will condition the arising of jhana in its own time, according to nature. You have to bring the mind to whatever stillness, whatever collectedness it will come to, and bring it to that again and again and again, and then just stay still. But it's with an attitude of appreciation, and with an attitude of contentment. Other qualities I keep mentioning, care, cherishing, appreciation, these very beautiful mental qualities, that the samadhi deepens by itself. So the way I understand Ajahn Chah's focus is it's the maintaining of mindfulness in all postures, mindfulness with clear comprehension. It's like knowing pleasant feelings, neutral feelings, unpleasant feelings, but also knowing wholesome thoughts as wholesome, unwholesome as unwholesome, various factors of skillful view. It's in maintaining mindfulness and clear comprehension that the samadhi develops by itself. And when it does, it's a samma samadhi, it's correct samadhi, samadhi that is wholesome, not the unskillful type of samadhi. And so you can see how faith plays a large role in having the energy to then apply the mindfulness consistently, having the resolution. And so we were talking about examples of the monks and nuns going off where there were ghosts and going off where there were tigers, and various things that they did because they had faith, but they were concerned about laziness or lack of consistency, so they would take themselves to a place where they would really pick up this practice as part of their refuge and then experiment. What's it like when you really embrace the meditation object and maintain it in being consistently, and often getting really great results. And We had a challenge where we don't have the tigers and we don't have the haunted cemeteries, so what do? And I was recommending contemplating not just death, but also rebirth. Because myself, I have a fear of taking an inauspicious rebirth if I can't be mindful as I'm dying. I have some fear, I think it's a wholesome fear, skillful fear, of not being able to patiently endure with painful, racking feelings if I should have a debilitating disease as I approach death. And so with that kind of healthy concern, then feeling inspired or feeling determined, feeling resolved to be consistent with the practice, keep trying, understanding, especially these retreat situations, the limited time that we have is a time to really investigate, is it true what the Ajahn is saying? If I'm consistently with my mindfulness, does some samadhi arise? If we're kind of looking for amazing, blissful, radiant states, you won't even recognize the samadhi that you've experienced. But basically, those periods when there wasn't much thinking, and there was a sense of stillness, a sense of coolness, a sense of clarity, a sense of tranquility, that's samadhi. And it's in bringing the mind to that and then resting and doing this again and again and again that samadhi becomes the jhana samadhi that people crave for. But it only comes through laying the causes and bringing the mind to that space and allowing it to rest, deepening. So we have our faith in Buddha and our potential. We have the energy that arises both from faith and also from consistent practice. Also, energy arises from keeping the precepts. So when you don't keep the precepts, you'll have a lot of remorse, anxiety, lacking in dignity and self-respect. So I also put focus on forgiveness because there's no point dwelling on past mistakes. That's already done. We do hopefully learn from it, but I put emphasis on forgiveness, loving acceptance, because metta is another way that we empower the mind, energize the mind, bless the present moment rather than have useless regrets about the past. The past is the past, it really is gone. And yes, we all make mistakes, but we have to learn from them. It's when you have metta for yourself that you don't do the mistakes again, because you care for yourself and others, and recognizing and respecting your potential and then wanting to honor it, wanting to develop it, wanting to realize it, then you won't do things that obstruct that. So the metta practice, another way we give rise to energy. Faith gives rise to energy, but especially the consistency with the mindfulness practice, not allowing the mind to run off in fantasies, not being distracted in the social media and the news and gossiping and all of that stuff. And so when the energy comes up, that's what becomes samadhi. When the energy settles, when the energy collects, when the mind isn't flowing out the sense doors as much, and it isn't flowing out the mind door as much in thoughts about the past and future, then it's just able to be in the present, and you'll notice it gets more and more energized, more and more palpable, a sense of energy that can become rapture and tranquility. And so I'm sure everybody has some experience of some tranquility and some rapture. Then we come to wisdom. So we've got the faith, energy, mindfulness, collectedness, samadhi, and then wisdom. So I'm going to go through the Anattalakkhana Sutta, speaking of wisdom. I promised people would go through that. Basically, when I was instructing you to notice the impermanence, notice the arising and the ceasing, notice the arising and the ceasing. So that's the wisdom practice. And then in not thinking about the past and in not thinking about the future, in just trying to stay in the present, seeing a thought as a thought, less identification, that's also wisdom. A thought arises and ceases, it's not self. So when you pick up the thoughts, follow on with thoughts and get lost in the thoughts, there's no wisdom. But when you're able to detach a little and just see a thought as a thought, there is mindfulness and wisdom present. It's just a thought. Same with the feelings. Encouraging people to bear with them as much as they can, investigate, notice the constant change and flux in feeling. So the awareness of anicca, and when you're able to detach, it's no longer my knee pain. It's just pain. And also, when mindfulness is good and clear, sometimes it's not pain, sometimes it's rapture, sometimes it's just feelings. Pleasant feelings, neutral feelings, painful feelings, all of them arising and ceasing and changing. There's actually millions of little feelings there if we have a closer look with a clearer mindfulness. So this emphasis on right mindfulness, consistent mindfulness, in just looking at things as they are, wisdom arises. Mindfulness is sometimes called truth-discerning awareness. I like that phrase. So mindfulness is that which sees things more correctly as they are, with less delusion permeating the experience. So in those 4 foundations of mindfulness, Lord Buddha is asking us to see the body as a body, see feelings as feelings, see thoughts as thoughts, and mind objects as mind objects, dhammas as dhammas. In doing this, just applying the bare awareness, the clear awareness that sees these things more objectively, that sense of identification falls away, and then you look closer and closer. It's like with a magnifying glass or with good glasses, just seeing the characteristics of things. When you don't identify things as being a self, that's actually wisdom. And then letting go of the feeling of being a self, not picking it up, not projecting it, not making karma with it, and just being aware, arising and ceasing, just feeling, not my feeling, just thoughts, not my thoughts. This is mindfulness and wisdom. As the retreat progresses, and if people are diligent, this foundation or this momentum, the insights get deeper. There can be a really clear seeing of impermanence, and then there's a more profound sense of the sense of self dropping away, an experience of a radiant mind that experiences the body without perceiving it as a self or thinking that it's a self. So these very practices that you're doing are correct, the methods that you're doing are correct, and when you maintain it with enough momentum, and so you already have some mindfulness, you already have some samadhi, you already have some wisdom, and it's just continuing and doing it with momentum that these things become deeper, they become more profound. And the little insights become deep insights, and deep insights can become profound insights can become liberating insights. But nobody says it's easy. It does require diligence, consistency, surrender, really embracing the practice wholeheartedly. But at least I know some of you have to go back, and I respect the fact that you were able to come for 3 days and you tried really hard. I think everybody's behaved very well, and I'd like you to make a commitment while you have some clarity and while you're recognizing your potential and your nature a little more clearly. I'd like you all to make some kind of a resolution to take care of these practices and try to make the time to come to another retreat, several retreats, whatever you can manage, but just make this a focus, because another phrase Ajahn Mun uses is the Arya Sap in Thai. It's the noble wealth. Often people are chasing wealth outside, and Ajahn Mun says this is the inner wealth, and this is the wealth that you can take with you. When you die, not yet liberated, have to take a rebirth, this wealth you can take. And Ajahn Mun says quite beautifully, no flood, no fire, no storm, no earthquake can destroy your inner wealth, and even death can't destroy it. So this is what should be the focus of our lives, is accumulating inner wealth. And it's something that's, for people who've grown up in very materialistic cultures and in consumeristic societies, it's a subtle thing to really get that every moment of mindfulness, every period of collectedness, every little insight is actually wealth. But it is. It's the true wealth. It's the inner wealth. It's the noble wealth. And it's the only wealth that you can take with you. So I hope that short discourse helped you to understand the 5 spiritual powers that lead to the deathless. We're going to have a look now. The Anattalakkhana Sutta is a fairly short, clear sutta. The people who have to leave, I just want to ask, can you raise your hands, the people who have to leave? Okay. just going to ask you now, who understands what Buddha is a little more clearly of those people? Very good. How many people feel more mindfulness than they did 3 days ago? Okay. Did anybody experience periods of collectedness, some tranquility, stillness? Very good. How about seeing things as impermanent more clearly? Yeah, okay. Less identification with feelings, with emotions, with moods? Very good. So this is the 5 spiritual powers functioning in your minds due to diligent practice. Very good. Just as a little bit of an introduction to the sutta, these 5 monks in the deer park had been practicing with the Bodhisattva when he was practicing the extreme of austerity. So if you recall, he was taking, I think, a little bit less than half a palm of rice, and he said that he became so emaciated that the stomach skin was touching the back skin in his body, and when he rubbed his arms, the hairs were falling out, and when he got up to go to the toilet, he would fall over. And he said that he wasn't allowing himself to enter jhana, even though he was adept, because if you recall, the Bodhisattva had studied with 2 teachers, and those teachers had taught him the jhanas, both the form jhanas and the formless jhanas. So the first 8 jhanas the Bodhisattva had mastery of. He had seen that they are a conditioned phenomena that degenerates. So even though it's incredibly blissful and boundless, and most people, by the way, would be completely deluded by that. You would grasp it and you would love it, and as soon as it degenerated, you'd do it again. And it's only the Bodhisattva with this incredible mindfulness and wisdom already present as spiritual powers that he could see this isn't the deathless, this also dies. So then he was experimenting, what about the absolute extreme of patient endurance? So that meant just bearing with. I'm sure he was sitting doing this pain practice, so you all know what it's like to have knee pain if you don't move for an hour. And imagine the Bodhisattva just sitting all day in the one posture, and the racking pains, and not to mention the hunger pains, and the cold, and the heat, and all the rest of it. And so he said about his heroic striving during that period that it is possible for a spiritual practitioner to have suffered as much in the past, because of, as we know, there have been many previous Buddhas. But he also did say it is impossible that any spiritual practitioner ever suffered more. So we know that it was pretty intense. So at a certain point he realized this isn't working either. And he decided that he was going to take a bath, and he decided that he was going to have some nourishing food, because he remembered under the rose apple tree as a youth, prince, he entered an absorption. He remembered that first experience of entering a jhana. It was the rice ploughing ceremony at the beginning of the wet season, and he was under the rose apple tree and he was looking at the beautiful colours and the nice ceremony and the joy and the lovely weather, and he closed his eyes and he entered jhana. So when you get your jhanas together for lifetimes, it might be that easy for us in the future too. But anyway, he was looking back on that experience and he realized that that was a kind of a pleasure that was harmless. It was a type of pleasure that was pure. It has a certain quality of purity, pure mental pleasure. And he wondered, if I was to combine that kind of concentration with focused investigation or contemplation, might that be the way that leads to the deathless? And he had a direct knowing, yes, that's it. And so he decided to give up the austerity practice. So what happened at that point is these 5 other monks thought, Gautama has reverted to luxury. That's the phrase they use. Gautama has reverted to luxury. And they were disgusted, and they abandoned him. Now, the Buddha, of course, wandered down, had a bath. Sujata and her milkmaids offered him some milk rice. He accepted 8 bundles of kusha grass. He sat under the Bodhi tree and he made his aspiration, I will not get up until I'm liberated. Let the blood dry up. And fortunately for us, he was liberated. After he was liberated, he was thinking, this is subtle, this is profound, most beings won't understand, this is going to be difficult to teach, I don't think I'll bother. And he delighted in the peace of the liberation for a week. At a certain point, was it Brahma or Indra? Brahma Sahampati came down and said, Lord, please teach, because there are beings that will understand. They have little dust in their eyes. So the Buddha, newly enlightened Buddha, by that stage, you imagine his spiritual powers totally blossomed, totally ripened to their fullest potential. His divine eye was extraordinary. In fact, one of the ways, part of his enlightenment experience was reviewing hundreds, even thousands of past lives, both of himself and other beings. So incredible divine eye faculty, laser-like precision and vast in its capacity to contemplate. So he scanned the beings of the universe and he saw that beings' minds were like lotus, and most were like these small buds in the murky water or down in the mud. And it was true. Those beings will not understand teachings on the middle way. They will not understand the four foundations of mindfulness. But then he saw there are other lotus buds higher up, some close up to the surface of the water, already beginning to open, and those above the water. And he realized there are those beings with little dust in their eyes who will understand. He also, the Brahma Sahampati said, these beings are wilting through not hearing the teachings. Please help them. There's a possibility that beings could degenerate if they don't hear this in time. So Buddha started to think, well, who could I teach? He thought of his first two teachers who taught him the jhanas, and he saw with his divine eye that they'd already been reborn in very high Brahma realms as a result of their absorptions. They'd already died, they were older than the Buddha, and they'd been born in very high Brahma realms, and he realized he couldn't teach them. Then out of compassion he thought of these 5 companions. Even though they'd rejected him and insulted him, he saw their spiritual faculties were ripe enough that he could teach them and they would understand. So he walked from Bodh Gaya. By that stage they'd moved on to the deer park near Varanasi, Istipatana Migadaye, the deer park in Istipatana. So when he went there, they said, don't greet him, don't pay respects to him, here comes that reverted to luxury monk. When they saw him, they saw that he was very radiant, and they did get up and take his bowl and his robes and made him a seat. They couldn't help themselves. Then he tried to teach them in the Dhammacakka Sutta, and I think they said, you reverted to luxury, how could you know anything? And he said for a third time, have I ever spoken to you like this before? I have found the deathless. If you listen to me, I will explain. And say, okay, you haven't spoken like this before. And so they did listen. And Anya, Kondanya, became a Sotapanna upon hearing the teachings of the Four Noble Truths. That dukkha has a cause, and that the cause can be abandoned. In hearing the teaching that there is a cause of dukkha, and the cause of dukkha can be let go of, and that the mind can be liberated from dukkha, Anya Kondanya had the insight, all that has the nature to arise has the nature to cease, and he became the first Sotapanna. So in the following days, Lord Buddha taught this sutta, where he explained, when you look at it, the words, it's a very basic, and so just as a bit of a lead-up though, what we can recognize here is that these were like spiritual heroes. They were practicing austerity, if not as extreme as the Bodhisattva, Gautama, a very similar level of practicing hardships. And so these people had great patient endurance, they had incredible resolution, incredible sincerity. So we read this simple teaching and we understand it as a theory, but by the end of the 2 pages, we're not arahants. But when Lord Buddha explained it to these bhikkhus, after those 2 pages, they were arahants. And so this is the 5 spiritual powers that I was talking about. When cultivated, when made much of, lead to the deathless, merge in the deathless. So whatever practice you do, cultivating your faith, developing your energy, sustaining your mindfulness, developing insight, establishing concentration, so that becomes a power. If those powers are not yet powerful, even you hear the correct teaching, you don't yet become enlightened. So one does have to cultivate them. And then they do need to be at a certain level. That lotus needs to be about to blossom. So if we're still down in the mud, we've got work to do. And it's not necessarily that the Ajahn didn't explain it properly.
Ajahn, what's the difference between the jhana under the rose apple tree and the jhanas that don't lead to deafness?
No, they do. But his insight was combining it with investigation and contemplation.
And was it all of the jhanas, or is it sort of one in particular?
So it's not in the jhana that you contemplate. You enter the jhana and one comes out of the jhana and then uses the energy from the samadhi in the contemplation.
So it was the contemplation element that he wasn't.
That's right.
Okay. And then the second question is, why did he have to be asked to teach? Like, he's enlightened, wouldn't he have come to that himself?
There's different theories about it. One interesting theory, this is a little bit of a distraction, but one interesting theory is that the powers of Mara and the powers of delusion are very powerful. Obstructive forces in the universe are powerful. So when a Brahma god descends from heaven and says, Buddha, please teach, all of those heavenly beings notice that. And they see, oh, there is a Buddha. He's enlightened. Then they have to do their duty to protect the Buddha and protect Dhamma practitioners. Whereas if they weren't aware of that, they might not do their duty. So that's one possibility. It might have been a posturing so that could happen, so that all those heavenly beings then get with the program and make their barami as well in protecting the practitioners and the Buddha. So I think there's probably something to that. Thus have I heard. At one time the Blessed One was dwelling at Benares in the deer park. There he addressed the group of 5 bhikkhus. Form, bhikkhus, is not self. If, bhikkhus, form was self, then form would not lead to affliction, and one might be able to say in regard to form, let my form be thus, let my form not be thus. But since, bhikkhus, form is not self, form therefore leads to affliction, and one is not able to say in regard to form, let my form be thus, let my form not be thus. So it's true, isn't it? Average age of this retreat is a little bit over 50. Can any of you will your bodies to be 15 years old again? So it goes its own way, doesn't it? And we can't stop it. So we refer to it as my body. But it seems to have its own nature. Feeling is not self. If, bhikkhus, feeling was self, feeling would not lead to affliction, and one might be able to say in regard to feeling, let my feeling be thus, let my feeling not be thus. But since, bhikkhus, feeling is not self, feeling therefore leads to affliction, and one is not able to say in regard to feeling, let my feeling be thus, let my feeling not be thus. So that peaceful mind state that you had, were you able to hold on to it and only experience that? How many people had the experience of a peaceful mind state degenerating, being replaced by a painful one? And how many people had a painful mind state becoming a peaceful one? Very good. But we can't will it to be as we like, when we like. What about the knee pain? Can you just decide that it goes away? How about arthritis? I no longer have these painful feelings. Perception is not self. If bhikkhus' perceptions were self, perception would not lead to affliction. One might be able to say in regard to perception, let my perception be thus, let my perception not be thus. But since bhikkhus' perception is not self, perception therefore leads to affliction, and one is not able to say in regard to perception, let my perception be thus, let my perception not be thus. So all of the things we've experienced in the past, that's how we perceive things. We perceive things according to our memories, to our experience, and so things come up and we perceive them in a certain way. And it's largely due to the way we perceived them in the past. So we can't just decide that I'm going to perceive all of the people in the room as devas and appreciate their beautiful qualities every time I see them. certain people you see them and there is, and certain people you see them and there's like, ah. And, this is things latent in the mind functioning. And it's the same with the weather, how people perceive it. Cold, chilly mornings, and the mind can become depressed if it's grey for too long, become happy and exuberant when it's very sunny. And these things, we're not in control of it. We can be mindful of it, we can try not to let it overcome the mind, overpower the mind, but we can't control the way we perceive things. Mental formations are not self. If bhikkhus' mental formations were self, mental formations would not lead to affliction, and one might be able to say in regard to mental formations, let my mental formations be thus, let my mental formations not be thus. But since bhikkhus' mental formations are not self, mental formations therefore lead to affliction, and one is not able to say in regard to mental formations, let my mental formations be thus, let my mental formations not be thus. So, many times I've said, thoughts about the future, don't pick them up, deal with the future when it comes. How many people, even with this instruction, found that the mind ran off into the future and they couldn't really stop it? Similarly with the past. I mentioned that practice I do myself of noting how many times I think a thought when I get a bit fed up with it, just to give myself the message, yes, I heard it the first 100 times. But you can't just say, don't ever think that thought again. And mine is particularly stubborn. If you do say, don't ever think that thought again, you'll probably find that you'll think it more. This is how you just have to seeing thought as a thought, not identifying with it. But you can't forbid thoughts. It doesn't work. And so we understand their nature. How many people feel tormented by their thought formations at times? Yeah, everybody. So it does lead to affliction. Consciousness is not self. If bhikkhus' consciousness were self, consciousness would not lead to affliction, and one might be able to say in regard to consciousness, let my consciousness be thus, let my consciousness not be thus. But since bhikkhus' consciousness is not self, consciousness therefore leads to affliction. One is not able to say in regard to consciousness, let my consciousness be thus, let my consciousness not be thus. So consciousness is a complex thing to understand. We have ear consciousness, eye consciousness, nose, tongue, body, and mental consciousness. But just one example is a sense of the bright and happy mind with some samadhi. That's a radiant mind state. It's a radiant consciousness, and so we can't just will that into being. And then it's the same with depression. If the mind falls into a depression and there's a sense of gloomy, glum, grey heaviness in the heart, in the mind, you can't just will that away either. So you can't just say, may I have the consciousness of, or if you could, entering jhana at will, these things are a process. You have to understand their conditions and lay the causes and work with the conditions. Even with people who are adept at jhana, there's a process for entering and there's a process for coming out of. And that was the Bodhisattva's insight. Even the jhanas, they have causes and conditions and they degenerate. So that was his profound insight about the jhanas, is that they're not permanent. We can't just have the state of the infinite base of space constantly. One has to keep generating that conscious state. So it's not dependable. And it is, because of that, it leads to affliction. What do you think about this, bhikkhus? Is form permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Lord. But is that which is impermanent painful or pleasurable? Painful, Lord. Is it fit to consider that which is impermanent and painful of a nature to age as this is mine, I am this is myself? It is not, Lord. What do you think about this, bhikkhus? Is feeling permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Lord. Is that which is impermanent painful or pleasurable? Painful, Lord. Is it fit to consider that which is impermanent, painful, of a nature to age, as this is mine, I am this is myself? It is not, Lord. What do you think about this? Is perception permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Lord. Is that painful or pleasurable? Painful. Is it fit to consider that which is impermanent, painful, of a nature to change, as this is mine, I am this is myself? It is not, Lord. What about mental formations? Permanent or impermanent? Impermanent. Painful or pleasurable? Painful. Is it fit to consider that which is impermanent, painful, of a nature to age, change, this is mine, I am this is myself, it is not Lord. What do you think about consciousness, bhikkhus? Is consciousness permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Lord. But is that which is impermanent painful or pleasurable? Painful, Lord. But is it fit to consider that which is impermanent, painful, of a nature to change, as this is mine, I am this is myself? It is not Lord. So then Lord Buddha instructs them now how to relate to these things wisely. Wherefore, bhikkhus, whatever form there is, past, future, present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, whether it is near or far, all form should, by means of right wisdom, be seen as it really is thus. This is not mine, I am not this is not myself. Whatever feeling there is, past, future, present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, whether it is far or near, all feeling should, by means of right wisdom, be seen as it really is. This is not mine, I am not this is not myself. Whatever perception there is, past, future, present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, whether it is far or near, all feeling should, by means of right wisdom, be seen as it really is thus. This is not mine, I am not this is not myself. Whatever mental formations there are, past, future, present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, whether they are far or near, all mental formations should, by means of right wisdom, be seen as they really are. This is not mine, I am not this is not myself. Similarly with consciousness, whatever consciousness, past, future, present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, near or far, all consciousness should, by means of right wisdom, be seen as it really is thus. This is not mine, I am not this is not myself. Seeing in this way, bhikkhus, the wise, noble disciple becomes disenchanted with form, becomes disenchanted with feeling, becomes disenchanted with perception, becomes disenchanted with mental formations, becomes disenchanted with consciousness. Becoming disenchanted, their passions fade away. With the fading of passion, the heart is liberated. With liberation there comes the knowledge it is liberated, and they know, destroyed is birth, the holy life has been lived out, done is what had to be done, there is no more coming into any state of being. Thus spoke the Blessed One, delighted the group of 5 bhikkhus rejoiced in what the Lord had said. Moreover, while this discourse was being delivered, the minds of the 5 bhikkhus were freed from the defilements through clinging no more. So that's a really wonderful and awesome paragraph, and that sentence in particular. Becoming disenchanted, their passions fade away. With the fading of passion, their heart is liberated. That's simple. So this is an interesting word, disenchanted. I think in Pali it's nibbida. And the passions fading, viraga. So there's some important things to acknowledge about that as a process. So we are fascinated, we're engrossed and fascinated, deluded by our bodies and our minds, and we're very committed to it. And when things go wrong, we like to blame things. It's the government's fault, or it's the weather's fault, it's the neighbour's fault, it's the kid's fault, it's the dog's fault. And often we don't look at the fact that it's our grasping that's the fault, it's our attachment that's the fault. And so when we become more mindful and more wise, we get that. We get that, no, it's my attaching, it's my thinking that I'm a self that's a problem. And it's my liking and disliking, that's the real problem. And then this sense of dispassion, you get fed up with that. And a reason I wanted to mention this is wholesome. This is a growth in wisdom, Bharami. This sense of being weary, being fed up. And that doesn't mean to say that you get angry and depressed and bitter and cynical. You have to understand, kind of a spiritual weariness is a wholesome thing. But it's no longer fascinated. You don't buy it anymore. You no longer think that you're going to be able to get samsara right. You're not going to be able to get samsara in order. You're not going to be able to arrange it in a certain way that you don't suffer anymore. You get that conditions are flawed, they are painful, they are impermanent, and then you get that you have to let go of your attachment to it. And that's where you become disenchanted with all of the tastes, the sounds, the sights, because you know they only give so much pleasure, and that pleasure doesn't last. And then there's the pain of being separated from it. And in being attached to the pleasure, you don't just get the pleasure, you get all the pain that's associated with the body and mind as well. And you just get that sense, it's not worth it. It's not a good deal. And you develop that intuition, there's something better. And that confidence, you are capable of experiencing something more dependable, more satisfactory, ultimately completely satisfactory, but it takes work. But this process of being disenchanted, becoming weary, this is what brings people to meditation retreats. This is what brings people to their meditation cushion. And one of the proximate causes for the arising of faith is actually suffering. If you don't have much suffering, you don't get around to investigating spiritual refuges unless you were born into a spiritually rich culture which still has some integrity. But most people, it's when life gets painful past a certain point that they start to seek the spiritual refuge. In becoming disenchanted, that means that you don't go chasing after it anymore. That's what allows the passion to weaken, becoming dispassionate, viraga. So there's the weariness. You spend more time alone. You spend more time meditating. You don't chase after these things. You restrain your sila and you refine your sila. In not acting on the greed, in not acting on the hatred, it starves. And the thickness of that kilesa that obscures your capacity to see things truthfully, the darkness of the greed and the hatred gets thinner and thinner and thinner. There's this thin veil of greed and hatred, and then the spiritual powers, the mindfulness, the wisdom, and then the energy, you have the capacity to throw it off the mind, explode it out of the mind, if you like. And so this process, becoming weary, is actually an important part of the process. And then seeing the suffering, I was talking about, Ajahn Anand says the beginning stages of practice can feel like you're in the burning house. Everything's on fire and it can feel like you don't have anywhere to go. But seeing the dukkha clearly is really important, because that's what inclines the mind to want to go inwards to the only place where there isn't dukkha. The only place where there isn't dukkha is your own purified mind, your own capacity to let go of your attachment. Then Ajahn Sumedho says, that which knows suffering isn't suffering. And Ajahn Anand said, it's through patiently enduring with knowing those painful feelings, so that's patiently enduring with mindfully knowing the unsatisfactoriness, that it becomes possible to see the burning house but not be in the middle of it burning. Part of the mind which knows this dukkha is cool. Mindfulness starts as a bit weak, but through training in mindfulness consistently it becomes strong mindfulness. Strong mindfulness becomes consistent strong mindfulness, and that becomes eventually what they call mahasati. Mahasati has the power to destroy the kilesa. So this is a process, becoming weary, then you have to put energy into cultivating your powers, because if you want something better, you have to work to establish that which is better in the mind. Other people who did it, the Buddha and the Sangha, but we have to do it. That's when it becomes the inner refuge, the spiritual qualities that become your own inner Buddha, your own inner Sangha. You become one who is practicing correctly, practicing rightly. Then you experience what it's like to have good sati, being able to detach, being able to see things as objects, as feelings, as a body. In doing this more consistently, the passions fade. In fading, the mind is liberated. So, good to have confidence where it goes. Once those faculties have become powers, and once those powers are powerful enough, the day will come where you will be able to say, done is what had to be done, there is no more coming into being, and you became one of the noble ones. So, I offer that for your reflection. today's Dhamma talk with an apology because I'm not sure how clear or lucid it's going to be, but I'm going to try. First of all, we're going to take the precepts, and always good to recollect what we're doing when we do this ceremony. So we're recommitting to a process or a training. So these precepts are a training. It's actually very difficult to keep them purely, especially in the area of speech. Many people will know. It's not telling lies. It's not just not telling lies, this musawada. It's also a harsh speech, frivolous speech, white lies, exaggerations, all of the stuff that we do around speech. So when we come to take the precepts, we wipe the slate clean and we start again, and we recommit to, we understand that these rules, these 5 precepts, are what the Buddha recommends as a foundation for successful meditation, foundation for feelings of well-being. And we have a look, how have we been going? How have we been going on them? So are we killing beings? Have we killed any beings, or are we being violent or aggressive towards beings? Taking that which is not given, are we only taking that which is given freely? Where are we with the second precept? Sexual misconduct, I try to think of this in terms of being responsible with sexuality. So are we being responsible? Are we being careful in this area? And the speech, as I was talking about, and then intoxication. Where are we with intoxication? It's very difficult in Australian culture. Alcohol is everywhere. Just noticing yesterday how all of the Woolworths have the Woolworths supermarket, and right next to it is liquor Woolworths. That's a new thing. I mean, it's probably been happening for a few years, but I just noticed it yesterday, that liquor is everywhere. So there's a lot of social pressure to drink. I think it's, if possible, it really is better not to at all, ever, and for a few reasons. One reason is, if you want to feel confident about your Buddhist practice, this is something you can do which gives you a feeling of confidence. This is not always understood, that if we're keeping these precepts in a really squeaky clean way, we can feel confident, and then we can feel confident about our respect for the Buddha as well. If we offer this to the Buddha out of respect, so there is the mind that says half a glass with dinner is okay. Okay, it's true, probably isn't too bad, that's true. But what we're doing is we're justifying doing something that we want. But if we say, okay, I'm going to give up that half a glass because I respect the Buddha and I respect his teachings, and I want the confidence and the dignity and the well-being that comes from knowing that I've surrendered to this training wholeheartedly, you probably get more well-being and more happiness if you can forsake the half a glass. The other thing about the half a glass is it often becomes 2 glasses, I know. So once you've had a few sips and it's very pleasant and the people around you are drinking as well. So sometimes it's just really nice to have that very clear line. And then you have the happiness that comes from having pure ethical conduct and knowing that you've surrendered to this training in a sincere way. Intoxication isn't just the drink and the drugs. It's good to have a look at what we do with these big screens, how much time we spend in front of them. And this one's off, so that's okay. I heard, someone told me there's a famous monk in Taiwan who has a TV station which apparently has a couple of million viewers, and apparently this monk is quite gifted in samadhi. Apparently Mara appeared to him in his meditation and said, "What are you doing using my tool?" Apparently Mara was upset about this. But it's interesting, isn't it? If Mara considers the television to be his tool, well then there's probably something. Intoxication can be just allowing the mind to be lost, allowing the mind to be dull. So that's a kind of an intoxication. And so I guess work all day, you probably need to relax a bit. It's okay to watch a little bit of TV, but it's like show some discernment, some discrimination. What are we watching? The problem, of course, is like once you're there on the lounge chair and you're having some chips and whatever, nuts or whatever, and you are relaxed, and the mindfulness isn't so clear, and the things in your hand, the control. So then it's very easy to look at what's the next thing, and then the next thing, and the next thing, and then you're going to bed with a very dull mind. So that's to be avoided if possible. With the TV, like watching only what is useful or consciously relaxing, but then kind of putting a limit to it. That after you've relaxed, you're going to go and do something skillful. Perhaps even more challenging, more dangerous now is the internet. So I know, I don't use it very much myself, but I know that when one is using it, time seems to go very fast. When you can read about the particular thing that you're interested in. And also the stuff around pornography is very dangerous, actually. So you have to be careful what you expose your mind to. Ask yourself, are you nourishing wholesome dhammas, or are you nourishing unwholesome dhammas? So just because we like something doesn't mean it's good for us. And it's the same with news. We can get kind of fascinated with news. It's very engrossing. But how much do we actually need to know? Sometimes watching too much news, it can be depressing. We can also become very self-righteous. We can end up feeling despairing when you lose your sense of trust in human beings and all these kind of things. And so keeping the amount of news at the right amount, and keeping the entertainment at the right amount, keeping distraction at the minimum. So that's the point, I think, of that precept around intoxication, is that we're trying not to be lost, trying not to be distracted, trying to maintain a focus in our life. Refuge. Thank goodness we have these refuges. The Buddha. So the Buddha was the proof that there's something much more in life in terms of our potential. There is a state completely beyond dukkha in all of its manifestations. That's pretty amazing. And we glimpse this when we have those moments of peacefulness, we have insights, we do glimpse what it's like to have an absence of dukkha. All Buddhist practitioners will be experiencing that in moments to some degree. And the Buddha is symbolic of someone who's gone completely beyond all forms of dukkha, transcended, liberated. So that's amazing. So the Buddha is a refuge of that historical being. It's also a refuge of our potential. So we understand that the Buddha started as a deluded being, someone deeply affected by greed, hatred and ignorance. And through training himself, he became the Buddha. And then the Buddha had this capacity to explain reality. And this is our problem, is that we don't perceive reality correctly. All unenlightened beings are ignorant, and because of ignorance we're deluded. Because of delusion we don't perceive things correctly. So the Buddha explained things more correctly in a lot of detail and in many different ways. So we have a better way of understanding the conventional reality, and then we have a training which leads to directly perceiving and then transforms the mind. At least the conscious experience is transformed to a state beyond suffering if we live according to the truth. So this is a very important principle. When we take refuge in Dhamma, we're taking refuge in truth, in ultimate truth. And then when we're training in the precepts, the Dhamma also includes the path that we cultivate and that we live in accordance with, so that we might realize that truth. So that's training in the precepts, training in meditation, being generous. And then Sangha is refuge. All of those people who have practiced correctly since the time of the Buddha and have realized the same result. This is also incredibly encouraging. It's not just this very special being that comes around every few eons. Or in this eon, apparently there will be 5, one more to come this eon. It's not just the Buddha that gets liberated. It's anyone who follows that training. And so even today, I believe, in this world we have people who are liberated, free from suffering, experiencing that state. Sangha also includes, so that's the highest end of Sangha, people who have actually realized the training. Sangha also includes those who are practicing correctly. So So that someone who's keeping the precepts, meditating a lot, and that's also your lay friends, your good lay friends, that's your lay sangha. Monks and nuns who are putting in a fair effort, and those are also sangha. And people who put on robes that aren't really training themselves, didn't have a good intention to become a monk or a nun, that's not sangha. So sangha is people who are cultivating mindfulness, cultivating wisdom, cultivating samadhi on that foundation of ethics. This is your sangha, and those people who've realized the result of practicing in that way, that's the sangha. So I just like every now and then to go over those refuges and those precepts so that when we do this ceremony, we do it with some understanding, and we're resetting that intention to continue to train ourselves, and we're holding this up as a mirror in a way. Where am I with these 5 precepts and the principles that they highlight? How am I going with these 5 precepts? And how deeply am I taking refuge? So I wanted to talk today a little bit about the 4 Brahmavihara, and sometimes called divine emotions, or the highest emotions. So these are among wholesome qualities. These are the extreme end of wholesome: mental qualities, emotional qualities. One of the reasons I like to talk about it is often a lot of what we're experiencing, a lot of our attitudes aren't based in these qualities. So when we consciously recognize that these are attitudes, these are qualities that are wholesome, skillful, again, I use the word a mirror. This holds a mirror to what's functioning in the mind, what's present in the mind. But not only does it hold a mirror to it, this is the wonderful thing about the Brahmaviharas, is it gives us an option. Now, something that can be observed about our culture, but not just our culture, perhaps modern life, is people seem to become quite seriously affected by cynicism, suspicion. We become somewhat hardened, and the way we're educated and the way media works, we become very critical. We're all very good critics. We become very fault-finding. And so if this is pervasive in a culture, we might not even notice it. It's just like, that's what you do. You complain a bit, you say what's wrong about the government, you say what's wrong with the economic policies, and you say what's wrong with the immigration policy and the environment policy and whatever. We can all grumble about lots of things, and it's not to say that there aren't things that are wrong. It's just to notice, to ask the question, is indulging these kind of thoughts and acting from this attitude helpful or skillful? And is it going to help us to be happy people? Is it going to help us to have some samadhi? Is it going to help us to develop wisdom? So the divine abidings, these emotions, starts as thoughts and then becomes an emotion. I'm going to read a definition that I found on the Dhamma encyclopedia. Something that definition doesn't say, which I think is very important, is that it becomes samadhi. These 4 qualities, when held in the mind with the right intention and with skillful effort, become a very powerful form of concentration. And so if we can train ourselves to hold any 4 of these qualities in the mind, that means that other qualities are not present in the mind at that time. So it's like, we might know that we're a bit cynical, we might know that we're critical, we might even know that we have a habit of withholding kindness towards ourselves, but we might not feel that we can do anything about it. We just kind of know that. And this is part of I'd say the problem of the modern world. And I was attending a talk recently, in America actually, by a layman, a lay teacher, a Tibetan, grew up in a very traditional religious Buddhist family, surrounded by other Tibetan Buddhists, but then went and studied in England and got a couple of degrees. I think he has his Geshe degree from one of those Tibetan monasteries, but he also has a PhD in psychology and a PhD in comparative religion or whatever. Anyway, he studied lots of things, and I was interested in his perspective. what he was talking about, Western culture, he was saying that he just gave one example. He said when it comes to psychopathology, when it comes to knowing the various things that can be wrong with people psychologically, there's this manual which is this thick, this thing, everything that's wrong. I think it's called the DPSM, and DPSM-4, and they're just about to come out with a DPSM-5, which is probably going to be thicker. And so, but then he said when it comes to like real manuals that you can grasp, which outline things which are good, things that you can do to stimulate wholesome mindsets, things that you can do to be happy, he said you can't really point to anything. There's no manual that we look to. There's no standard that we look to as modern people that's like this is how you go about being happy. This is how you go about having a healthy mind. And well, I thought that was very revealing about our culture. This is something that intelligence in the head tends to kind of discriminate. That's very good at knowing what's wrong. So our culture's cultivated that a lot. Now this does have some advantages, but it needs to be in perspective. The Brahma Viharas is emotional, isn't it? It's in the heart. So we train our thoughts. So if suppose you want to cultivate loving kindness, we start with the wish, may I be well, may I be happy. It's a thought. May all beings be well, may all beings be happy. But then we're trying to stimulate a blossoming of an emotion in the heart center. So this is bringing us, it starts with the head, but it's bringing us down into the heart. Similarly with compassion, may I be free from suffering, may all beings be free from suffering. With compassion we're trying to feel with or empathize with the suffering of ourselves and of others. So this, again, it's coming into the center, and it's not looking at why there's a problem and why there shouldn't be a problem and who should be doing something about the problem. It's going underneath that to the central fact of suffering and then responding with something wholesome. I'll talk a little bit more about that now, and I'll mention now that next Saturday's workshop is going to have compassion as the main theme, if anyone's interested. I'm going to do a bit more work there. Mudita, incredibly helpful. Empathic joy, sympathetic joy. Now this is a wonderful antidote to cynicism, sarcasm, suspiciousness. This is where we train ourselves, we force ourselves to notice what's okay about ourselves and good, and about our situation and our life, and also that in others. So this is a very good and powerful tool. And then equanimity. Equanimity is actually very profound. We tend to think that equanimity is nothing, or we think it's indifference. Equanimity is more like understanding things the way they are. Because of having a very good understanding of the things as the way they are, one can remain in a state of equipoise, or a state of perfect balance, serenity. So it's actually it's a powerful emotion which is neither moving towards or moving away from, but it's an emotion with an incredible amount of clarity and stillness and balance. So equanimity is a wonderful thing. And so the thing I think I just want to hold up to remind us all, remind myself too, is that there are these powerful tools that we have. So if we have which we can train our mind with. So we have our habits, and then we can, in this training, mental training, we can choose to train the mind in a different way. So we have our social conditioning, and we have the way that society affects us. And then at a certain point, as a Buddhist, Buddhism is a religion, a philosophy, a science for people who want to take responsibility. The Buddha says that he only points the way, and that we have to walk that way. So it's a religion for grown-up people who want to take responsibility. So at a certain point, we decide that we're going to train ourselves, whether the people around us are behaving skillfully or not. We are going to train our own minds to become more wholesome and lay that foundation for developing insight. So I'll just read this definition. The four Brahma Viharas are considered by Buddhism to be the four highest emotions. The word Brahma literally means highest or superior. It is also the name given to the Supreme God in Hinduism during the Buddha's time. Vihara means to dwell, to live or to abide. Thus the Brahma Viharas are not emotions one occasionally feels, but that one lives in and lives by all the time. So that's what we would aspire for. That would be the result. Like any emotion, any mental habit, the more the mind becomes acquainted with it, the more the mind takes on the qualities of that habit. So just like we might have a suspicious tendency, a cynical tendency, an angry towards oneself habit. If we train ourselves in responding in these ways, in cultivating these as attitudes, one is able to abide in these attitudes. This is it's not something that one can just do. So that's the one thing I'm not so. One just by understanding this concept doesn't mean that one can do it, but we understand the potential. That as people being generous and practicing with precepts and meditating, that we can, through meditating skillfully, become habituated to abide in these attitudes most of the time. I really think that is the result of Buddhist training. And these four Brahmaviharas, loving kindness, compassion, empathic joy, and equanimity, can be understood from several different perspectives, as four related but not separate qualities, or perhaps as four different ways the spiritually mature person relates to others according to their situation. So they are mature ways to relate to oneself and others. So most modern people think a lot. And so in our meditation, I think it's a good thing to learn to use thought. So when you come to your cushion and you find that you're thinking a lot, well then we can pick up these phrases and these words, or we can even contemplate for a while why it's helpful to have loving kindness. We can look at the drawbacks of being grumpy, getting angry, holding on to grudges, and we can look at the benefits, just using your own contemplative faculty, look at the benefits of thinking with loving kindness, and then we come to a sense, yes, loving kindness is wholesome, skillful, valuable. We have to understand ourselves, we have to want, to have success in meditation, you have to see the value of what you're meditating on, and you have to really bring that into your heart with sincerity. So we actually spend a minute or two contemplating. The Buddha says loving kindness is really valuable, really helpful. Is it? So you can ask yourself. Because if you just come and you sit and you think, may I be well, may I be happy, it might not happen. You might not get much of a response. But if you really recollect why loving kindness is valuable, what is it the antidote to? What does it balance in the mind? What's the result? And from the experiences that you've had where loving kindness meditation has been effective, what was the result? Did you feel happier? Was the mind brighter? Was it more spacious? Was there an absence of habitual heaviness or hardness or darkness? And then you think, yeah, okay, I agree. Loving kindness is wholesome, skillful, valuable. And then we use our thought, may I be well, may I be happy. Another thing we can do is we could ask, well, what does it mean? What would it mean to be well? I like to encourage people to invest these words with special meaning, so you can spend some time contemplating, what would it mean to me to be well? It might mean that it might mean that I have 3 espressos a day instead of 4, and that I spend 1 hour on the internet instead of 5, and that I get my credit debt, that I only have 1 maxed credit card, that, for you, what would it mean to be well? It means we want to do a little bit better than we're doing so that we have more well-being. And then so when you say this, may I be well, you really wish that. May I make skillful decisions, may I maintain healthy disciplines, may I abandon that which isn't skillful. That's what it means to wish yourself well. So you can spend a couple of minutes and then be careful here when you do that, not to get too far out of the contemplation. Start just proliferating too much. You just want to establish a sense of sincerely applying oneself to the meditation, seeing the value of it. And then, may I be well, may I be happy. And then hopefully opening the heart, some warmth, some love really. It's kind of goodwill, unconditional love, and just aiming that in the heart and then opening that up and then just allowing that and using the breath, breathing in, may I be well, breathing out, may I be happy, and just allowing it to abide there in the body. And then we train in radiating it outwards. When we train in this way, we train at first with people who it's easy to have loving kindness towards, so we bring them to mind. And breathing in, may I be well, breathing out, you actually picture that person or get a feeling, not everyone's visual, just get a feeling for that person being there and radiate that warmth out towards them. You don't try to send your mind, if it's your long-lost friend who's in London, you don't try to send your mind to London, that's too exhausting. You just try to bring that person to you. And there's a sense of don't send the mind too far away, just keep it there and feel confident that person's there. The thing about mind that's very interesting is it's not bound to space and time in the same way that bodies are. I've heard many stories of people, even though they were on the other side of the world, feeling something when people radiated loving kindness towards them or when they dedicated merit towards them. So you can feel confident that if your loving kindness meditation really has some integrity, that it will affect people in a positive way. The near enemy I just wanted to talk about the near and far enemies. The near enemy to loving kindness is affection. So this is something to be careful of. So when there's affection, there's attachment. So loving kindness is goodwill. It's not a grasping at the being. It's just wishing them well. So the next step in the loving kindness meditation is that we move on to neutral beings. This is actually very important if we want to take it on as a discipline. We radiate loving kindness to neutral people. So that might we actually bring to mind the cleaning lady that we hardly ever talk to, but that we know, or the gardener, or the taxi driver. All of those Indian taxi drivers, may they be well, may they be happy. Just people that you don't know personally, but that you see. May they be well, may they be happy. And then we train in really being able to hold more of these people who are not in the category of our friends, those who we're close to, those who we habitually have contact with. We train the mind in actually being able to offer this attitude to more and more beings. Then we start to include those that it's difficult to have loving kindness toward. So once we can maintain the thoughts in a focused way, and then it becomes a wholesome feeling, and then that wholesome feeling really gets some power, it's then possible to aim that at even people who we would usually find it very difficult to have loving kindness towards. And that again is really helpful in having the meditation not being affected by the near enemy of affection. Because if we can train ourselves to having loving kindness even for people who suppose have hurt us, or have hurt people that we know, or who are hurting people now, or who are making really stupid decisions which affect us all badly, that we can radiate loving kindness towards that person. It doesn't mean that we don't understand what is conventionally skillful or not skillful. It just means that we truly wish people well. And in fact, if people were well, they wouldn't be doing the unskillful things that they do. So we actually wish that may they be well, may they be happy. Ill will is the far enemy of loving kindness. So again, when we habituate the mind to this, we'll probably notice when those feelings of ill will come up. Because I actually want to hurt somebody. Okay, well then you know, okay, that's definitely not loving kindness, that's the far enemy. Sometimes before we meditate, we might not have even noticed how often we have these little moments. And we begin to meditate and we realize, oh, even though I'm a fairly nice person, every now and then I want to kill somebody. And it is important to become truthful about that and become aware of it, because we all have that potential actually. It is, I think the prisons are full of people who many people made one bad mistake. And we tend to get this image in our mind, murderers, bad people. But it might have just been the case that people were pushed into a painful corner and lost their temper and ended up in jail with this word murderer. We actually all have this potential. If we're in enough pain, if we don't have enough mindfulness, we can all end up being the murderer in jail. So very important to become very mindful of these things, and very important to be cultivating their antidotes, weakening the tendency towards this quality and deepening the tendency towards other qualities. Compassion, also a subtle quality, very profound. Compassion is feeling with suffering. At the same time, one isn't distressed. Now this is tricky. And this is why it's a type of samadhi. Because if it wasn't samadhi, we wouldn't be able to maintain that center with an integrity. So it starts as thoughts, but it's important to know what it is. Compassion, when it's really functioning, what is it like? So it isn't pity. In pity, that's the near enemy, by the way. The near enemy to compassion is pity. Pity is where there's an us, someone there feeling sorry for that person. So there's too much self in that. And where forgetting, if we're feeling pity, we're forgetting that we are still in this samsaric story, we're still in the situation where we might be that person. So it might be the case, you feel sorry for the starving Ethiopians, but, what if we run out of petrol and we can't get, and there's no food in the supermarket, then we're going to be the starving Australians. It's like really possible. So it's, we understand that any of us could all of a sudden be in a situation with very coarse suffering, unfortunately. This is part of our samsaric predicament. So compassion is aware that human beings, all conscious beings, not yet liberated, are prone to, vulnerable to, terrible suffering. And so it's a feeling with and responding with wishing that it was otherwise, and even wishing to do something about it, and yet not being distressed. Now this is tricky. You don't take on the suffering as your personal suffering. You just really wish it was otherwise. So if there isn't some samadhi there, it's not actually possible. And I think loving kindness is a little easier to do than compassion. And doesn't get mentioned very much in Theravada Buddhism, actually, compassion. But it's tricky. To really have compassion requires a lot of maturity. And that area of knowing, it's understanding that it's not pity and that it's not about taking on the suffering. It is about wanting to do something and actually doing something if you can. But then there needs to be a certain amount of equanimity as these qualities balance each other. It's a set of 4 emotions, and equanimity is very important. It plays a role in making sure that metta really is metta. There isn't that affection there. Goodwill, impartial goodwill, there's some equanimity there. That compassion isn't pity, and that we're not falling into a state of misery because of the suffering in the world. That actually, even if you have a lot of compassion, in that moment part of the mind will be very serene, very peaceful, if it's real compassion. And yet, you really want to do something to make there be less suffering in your experience and other beings' experience. And if you're capable, you will. Mudita, sympathetic joy, empathic joy, that's feeling good, genuinely feeling good about the good fortune that you have and that others have. This is a really good thing to do if you find that you're depressed, if you find that you're just grumpy, you find you're negative, you find you couldn't be bothered. So we all find ourselves in that state. At times, you come to your meditation, you can ask yourself, okay, what is it in my life that I could feel good about? And if it's really bad, you'll think, nothing. And that's something that you shouldn't believe. Very important here to have perspective. And we need to have this samsaric perspective. It's like if you have food on the table today, you're a person of extraordinary good fortune. Because I think about 70% of the planet is malnourished. So it's like we forget this. We forget when we live in our suburban worlds, we forget that most beings on the planet are struggling just to get enough to eat. And then if you live in a place where you're not confronted with very coarse violence on a daily level, you're very fortunate. Because there's lots of parts of the world where little children grow up playing with guns. The guns are so pervasive in cultures, particularly South America, Africa, parts of Russia. There's so many guns around, and parts of rural America. And that violence children see from childhood and people are confronted with. Inner cities in America, there's a lot of violence around from early childhood. So if you're a person who's not experiencing threats to your life on a daily basis, you're very fortunate. We forget this, we completely forget it. Although it's on the news and we see it, we tend to forget it, it's somewhere else. We don't realize the incredible benevolence that we're currently experiencing. So having food, having relative safety, okay, this is a result of merit. So this is the thing that you can rejoice in. You can rejoice in the fact that you are experiencing the results of having lived with virtue, having not been violent, having been generous. Well, that's why you have enough food on the table, and that's why you're not being confronted with violence daily. But you have to do some work. First of all, you have to recognize the good fortune. There's an enormous amount of good fortune here. I'm not recognizing it. I'm going to challenge my depression. I'm going to challenge my cynicism. Where's the good fortune? Your physical health. having you can always complain about the healthcare system, but it's one of the best in the world in Australia. So I was recently in America. In America, you have to have insurance, and when you get your insurance policy, usually any pre-existing condition is not covered. So what that means is that's not a healthcare system, is it? It means that you can be treated for any sickness you have after this point, but anything you've had before, or anything you have now where we won't cover, that's not very nice. And then a lot of people don't have any health insurance at all, and health costs in America are incredible. So you have these situations where someone loses a job, and their health care was given to them by their employers, and they're covered for 6 months after they're fired. And then all of a sudden, this person who was living this middle-class life defaults on their mortgage and has no health care. So this doesn't happen to us. We're very lucky. It's just kind of recognizing, again, there's a lot of benevolence. We can always find fault with the way things are, but the amount that is good in this culture is extraordinary. So it's like there's a lot to feel joy for. There's a lot to feel grateful for. Now, gratitude is something very similar to mudita, when one feels grateful. And it doesn't really work to say to yourself, you should feel grateful. You have to bring to mind a sense of comparison to recognize, and then gratitude is the response. When you recognize that most beings are hungry, our biggest issue is, I don't want to get fat. So we have more suffering about feeling fat than we have about feeling hungry. Well, that's lots of people smiling, kind of the suburban reality. I don't like being fat either, by the way. So you all stare at me after you offer the food, and I feel like I have to eat it. But anyway. So sympathetic joy, that means, well, what about if someone else gets the promotion that you wanted? And this is where we have to train ourselves. If someone has done something good and is rewarded for that we feel happy for them. We feel happy with them. So this is the opposite of competition, jealousy. So this is an antidote to a lot of those negative things. So we actually feel happy. Suppose you want a baby for 10 years and you didn't have one, and your sister's just had her 4th boy. You feel happy for her. And maybe ask for one. When things that you want happen to other people, you feel happy for them. This is a training. It doesn't happen automatically. We have to train ourselves to think in this way. But it's perfectly possible. Appreciative joy, sympathetic joy, recognizing what is good in your life and appreciating it, and seeing what is good in other people's lives, success in other people's lives, and being happy for them. And equanimity, I was talking about that a bit. I think the very best way to cultivate equanimity is meditating. Because when we meditate, we're seeing a thought as a thought and we're pulling back from it. We're seeing a feeling as a feeling and we're pulling back from it. In that process of cultivating breath meditation. And we're developing an understanding. Thoughts will arise, they'll stay for a while and they'll cease. Feelings will arise, they'll stay for a while and they'll cease. And then this is establishing equanimity. That part of the mind which is mindful and can see phenomena as they are and is not moving either towards or from, that's equanimity. So we meditate more and more and more, then equanimity is a result. Equipoise. Ajahn Sumedho uses the word serenity. Equanimity, in terms of the types of samadhi, it becomes 4th jhana. So it's a very profound quality. We have to, if one is training in jhanas, most of us aren't, but it's just nice to know where these things go. The first few jhanas, intense rapture and tranquility, and then the mind becomes deeper, more deeply peaceful, that it actually goes beyond, more deeply into peacefulness than into the rapture or the pleasure, the pure pleasure. The types of pleasure that come in samadhi is a type of pure pleasure. A deepening of samadhi is when the mind is going more and more deeply into peacefulness, so that it's not attached, it's not even holding on to the pleasure. Samadhi is more of a process of letting go of the 5 senses, letting go of the world, letting go of outside conditions, turning inwards. When we do that, incredible pleasure arises in the mind, and then one goes even deeper into the samadhi, into this state of equanimity. That's the fourth jhana. And so, according to what I've read and what I've discussed with my teachers, once people become sotapannas and sakadagami, so stream enterers and people who just have a couple of lives together, this fourth jhana is the foundation for purifying the last remaining defilements. It's by placing the mind in this deeply peaceful, unmoving state that the remainder of the greed and the remainder of the hatred gets starved of its nutriment. So it's a very profound quality and has a very profound role to play. And it's just nice when we're trying to kind of embrace a training and we're trying to understand the value of something, it's just nice to see where it goes. So equanimity is a very wonderful and profound thing. It will take us all a great distance if we, whatever we can do to cultivate serenity, equanimity, equipoise, mindfulness and wisdom that results in equanimity. It's very good to do as much of that as possible. So I think I've probably said enough. I did pretty good considering I have the flu. Thank you. I was just thinking, I was sitting meditation and I was thinking, I don't think this is going to come together. And what I thought was, due to the merit of these people coming to listen to Dhamma, may there be some Dhamma. So thank you. Are there any questions about the Brahmaviharas, anything I was talking about? How many people practice loving kindness meditation? Very good. How many people practice compassion as a meditation? Okay, a few people. They're very closely related. It's very helpful to acknowledge suffering because one can open the heart of loving kindness. I often teach that we just bring to mind the very fact of suffering and then we respond to suffering with kindness. So it is good to give compassion a little bit more attention, so hopefully some of you will come next Saturday and do a bit more work on that.
When we talk compassion, Buddha is the person with the biggest compassion.
Yes.
Of course, he did not go soup kitchens and fed everybody, but it's a state of mind, as you said.
It's a state of mind. It says, there's this beautiful phrase in the sutta, the Buddha's mind imbued with compassion, quivering for the sake of beings. So he did go to enormous trouble to help us. So that's an expression of the compassion. And there are examples in the suttas where the Buddha scans the world and he sees that 20 miles away there's one person who could be liberated and he walks that distance. So there are examples of his incredible compassion. But also when he was under the Bodhi tree and he was thinking, this which I've discovered is very refined, very difficult to realize, beings won't understand it, and if I try it will be troublesome for me and wearying, so maybe I won't. The fact that he did is compassion, isn't it? So when he was experiencing the bliss of liberation under the Bodhi tree, he didn't have to teach anybody, but he did. He started a monk's order, and then a nun's order, and then this huge lay following. This is all an expression of his compassion. And then when the monks were fighting in Kosambi, they're going and trying to sort out their fight, and they said, "This is our problem, Buddha. Don't worry about it." And he admonished them 3 times. And, most of the suttas you can see is a response. His compassion. He doesn't talk so much about compassion, but you can see the fact that he's trying to train the king, that he's trying to train the courtesan, that he's even training the prostitutes. He's incredibly compassionate, and that his order was open to beings from every caste. This at that time was profound. So his compassion was also impartial. Anyone who had the faculties and who was free of debt was able to become a monk or a nun. Pretty amazing.
What I would say that it is a very high state of mind, rather than focusing on the action you do. Of course, you do what are coming after that. But really
it's coming from that, exactly. It's coming from the mind, imbued with that quality. There's that beautiful phrase, Buddho Susudo Karuna Mahanavo, the Buddha, absolutely pure with ocean-like compassion. Beautiful. Yep.
2 questions. The one is, does compassion come relatively easily to people that have experienced personal loss of pain?
Yeah.
And secondly, what does it, I mean, I've heard this expression, compassion fatigue.
Fatigue.
Compassion fatigue.
Okay, yeah, social workers, psychologists, yeah, nurses. I think compassion can come easier for people who have suffered. I think so. Suffering leads to a humility. Suffering can lead to a humility. It can also lead to kind of bitterness, resentment, feeling closed off, kind of a victim consciousness. But suffering can lead to a greater empathy. And as one of the quotes, I did bring something, just in case I couldn't think of anything, I brought a few quotes. Jack Cornfield says, "Compassion is the heart's response to sorrow. We share in the beauty of life and in the ocean of tears. The sorrow of life is part of each of our hearts and part of what connects us with one another. It brings with it tenderness, mercy, and an all-embracing kindness that can touch every being." Part of what connects us with one another. So if we have the insight that just like me, I'm a vulnerable and sensitive being, and right now I'm suffering, if we then have that insight, that basic insight that every single other being has this same vulnerability, this same sensitivity, and the insight of, wow, suffering is serious phenomena and has its own validity, very real to the person experiencing it, and then empathy and sensitivity. And we become aware of, okay, so what would be helpful to me in this situation and what wouldn't be helpful to me in this situation. We notice certain things are helpful, certain things aren't helpful, and then we bring that to others hopefully. So, but I think that having suffered a bit is very good for being compassionate. We're less arrogant when we know that we too also suffer terribly and can suffer terribly. And then with the other thing about compassion fatigue, that would mean that there's not yet enough samadhi. So it's like not really having the energy in terms of a collectedness. Because when we have compassion in terms of samadhi, it charges up the battery, it charges up that center, this quality is there, and then it's radiated outwards. So if there isn't the samadhi, but you have to hear about this misery, and then you have to hear about that misery, and you have that misery, you become another suffering being. There isn't the clarity, there isn't the centeredness. And that's part of what happens in our culture when everyone specializes. So it's the social worker that has to hear about the terrible suffering day after day after day, and the nurses that have to work with the people in terrible pain day after day after day. And in a more traditional culture, you have that be kind of a shared burden, that the whole village would be somehow helping with the old ages and the death and the sorrows and the griefs. So that becomes a question of how do you, if you are someone who works in those industries, if you are someone experiencing compassion fatigue, what do you do? Many people end up doing retreats because they find that that's the best thing. The best thing to do to recharge the heart is to give yourself that kind of attention and bring the energy back inwards, have a break for a while. So people having to spend a lot of time with people who are suffering, coarse suffering, need to find ways to set boundaries with it and take care of themselves as well, understanding that they're one of the beings who also suffers. I think it's a good thing to do when we are suffering, is to set that intention, okay, I'm going to do my best to cause as little suffering to other beings because suffering hurts. That's a good time to set the intention. I go, this is what it feels like to have been humiliated, this is what it feels like to be insulted, this is what it feels like not to be able to work. You know, we develop sensitivity to other people experiencing difficulties and set that intention to try to be a wholesome influence and not an unwholesome influence in people's lives. Then at least our suffering has some benefits. Yeah.
And compassion comes easily for a person who has wisdom and understanding, rather than a person who lives among people who suffer. Because I think it is starting inside and going out, rather than coming from outside inwards.
But sometimes people who are heady, wisdom and understanding, can sometimes not be very compassionate. And sometimes people who are kind of like your grassroots granny, who might not have very much intellectual understanding, may be very compassionate. So you don't necessarily need to have understanding to be compassionate.
Wisdom and understanding.
You don't necessarily need to have wisdom. It's a heart quality. It's that when you see suffering, you wish that person wasn't suffering. It's here. And if you apply your intelligence to it as well, it's good. You can train it as a discipline. But a lot of people in agrarian cultures just respond to suffering with, traditional cultures respond to suffering with acts of kindness. So it's not, you don't have to have a profound understanding, you don't need to know that it's a Brahma-vihara to do it. It's just and it's a challenge for people who are too intellectual to actually really get down to what it is. Anyway.
When we are doing reflections, we often tend to go into the justification.
Mm-hmm.
So is there any elements in mind that we can check whether we are doing reflections or justification?
You'd have to be more specific. What particular area?
No, I don't have any specific, but it's just that...
The thing about justifying is there'll be a sense of self there.
Okay.
And so if there's a sense of self-justifying, and there'll be an agenda, so the thing that you want to do, or why you had to do the thing you had to do. So that's the thing to be a bit suspicious of. So if there's a me there, justifying, usually Buddhist reflections, there's not the sense of self will be, in Brahma-viharas, it will be very spacious and porous. So there's a particular feeling about that. May I be well, may all beings be well, may I be happy, may all beings be happy. That's very open. But if you're justifying something, you'll have there's a sense of self there, and the thoughts won't be peaceful. So it'll be agitated. So that's kind of my experience anyway. If we're justifying something, there's a sense of agitation and there's a sense of holding. So if it's a wise reflection, there'll be a sense of spaciousness, a sense of opening. Hopefully that's helpful. Okay. Now I officially say hello. Good morning. Nice to see you. So it's 3 years since I was last doing any teaching in Melbourne. That seemed to go quite quickly. Now here we are. This morning I wanted to talk about a refuge and about faith and about our training in the precepts. And I wanted to do the ceremony of taking precepts, going for a refuge, actually as a contemplation. I just ask how many people in the room consider themselves to be Buddhists. Please raise your hands. Is anybody not sure? That's okay too. Raise your hands. Okay, we've got a room full of Buddhists. So that would mean that most of us have done these ceremonies before many times. And it's important to have a look at what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it. We review what we're doing, and we're training in doing things with mindfulness and clear comprehension. So I like to have a fresh look at these ceremonies and contemplate them a bit, because they're very beautiful actually. And as with anything that we do habitually, it can become a little bit empty in a not such a good way. There's the other type of emptiness, profound emptiness, blissful emptiness. Your meditation and contemplation will help you to realize. If you do your study, you listen to the masters, we hear that if one attains to stream entry, first stage of enlightenment, there's no more superstitious grasping at rites and rituals. Some modern people misunderstand this. There's a sense of Sotapannas don't grasp at rituals, therefore stream enterers don't grasp at rituals, therefore the rituals aren't important. That's not what the real practice is. Real practice is the method. So we have that, in a way, scientific bias. You want to grasp at the method. I think the correct way to understand it is superstitious grasping at rites and rituals, thinking that the rite or the ritual or the ceremony is the thing that will get you enlightened. That's the misunderstanding that falls away. Ceremonies, on the other hand, when practiced with mindfulness and with awareness, have an important function. So even the stream enterers that I know do lots of ceremonies. They do them mindfully. And so it's understanding how to use something as a skillful means, as a tool, to help you to continue to train your mind. And so we say these words, Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi. I go for refuge to the Buddha. It's interesting that we say it for the second time and the third time in that ritual. I think there's a reason for this. I think Lord Buddha knew that we have a tendency to rush through things and not consider what we're doing. So even he's asking us to say it a second time, say it a third time. I think he wants us to think about this. So I'm going to talk about these refuges, and after I've talked about them a little bit, I will ask you to repeat after me as a contemplation and as a way of engaging the ceremony, hopefully with a little more understanding, a little more sincerity and enthusiasm, making the ceremony vibrant, making the ceremony something which generates energy, enthusiasm, faith, that we can then bring to our meditation practice. So what is Buddha? Who's the Buddha? So we know from our own experience that the mind is affected by greed, by irritation, aversion, sometimes hatred. Sometimes we don't recognize that the mind's affected by delusion because delusion deludes us. We are deluded. And it's when we train to recognize our delusion, delusion can start to fall away. But most of us as Buddhists will acknowledge that there is greed, there is aversion, irritation, hatred, and there is delusion. So Lord Buddha realized something beyond that. And then he explained how other beings can accomplish that. So having gone beyond greed, hatred and delusion, sometimes described as enlightenment, sometimes described as liberation. So what did he become enlightened to? With regards refuge of Dhamma, Dhamma is truth, nature. So it was in seeing the truth of things as they really are, with mindfulness, clear comprehension, quite a bit of concentration, the Buddha's mind was liberated. So it was through seeing ultimate truth, deeper truth, that the delusion fell away. Ignorance is the reason that greed, hatred and delusion continue to function in our minds. The remedy to ignorance, what does ignorance mean? Ignorance means not knowing things clearly according to their true nature. Because we don't know, we misperceive them, that's delusion. Because we misperceive things, that's why it's possible to be greedy, that's why it's possible to have aversion, irritation, even hatred. When the mind has enough clarity and mindfulness, really sees a body as just a body, arising due to conditions, changing, dying, and all of those thoughts arising due to conditions, changing, ceasing, seeing that it's not a self. What is there to be greedy about? What is there to be angry about? Who is there to love and who is there to hate? And so it's through seeing Dhamma, the truth, that Lord Buddha became Lord Buddha, the one who knows ultimate truth. This is not an easy accomplishment. All of you who've been meditating for some time are aware that the power behind the habit is pretty awesome, actually. The various habits that we have, the things we crave for, the things we want, the things we don't want, And many times you come to meditate and you might know that various ways of thinking are deluded, unskillful, but they don't necessarily go away. Still thinking the same things or similar things. And one gets a sense that these habits have some momentum. And this is, if you take what Lord Buddha said literally, samsara has no discernible beginning. It does have an end for the individuals who uproot their attachment to it. Literally millions of past lives, all of us. It's interesting, isn't it? We first begin to consider the concept of previous lives, future lives, as there's this limited personality with its perspective tries to imagine a few lives before and a couple of lives after. And Lord Buddha is saying, actually it's hundreds, thousands, millions of lives. Myself, I believe this. I don't have any doubt. Having got a bit of a whiff, a bit of a sense for the power of my habits, I don't doubt that they have quite a bit of momentum behind them. Lord Buddha liberated himself from the cycle of rebirth through letting go of his attachment to bodies, thoughts, feelings, sights, sounds, tastes. And then he described his experience as being an experience of unshakable peace, an experience, he usually describes it in terms of negation, he describes it in terms of what isn't there. There's no suffering, or no experience of anything even subtly unsatisfactory. So what that means is his experience of enlightenment was completely satisfactory, a very satisfying experience. And so when we go for refuge to the Buddha, there are many ways that we can contemplate that, many feelings, wholesome feelings that we can have in relationship to that. One is awe. Isn't it amazing that this being found a way out? And then that same feeling of awe you can bring inwards and understand, isn't it wonderful? Lord Buddha explained, that's my potential. Lord Buddha realized ultimate nature, his ultimate nature also, which is not self. We have to use a conventional speech. He realized not self. He did. And we have that potential to realize not self, and in realizing not self, be liberated from the way that we grasp at all these things, which is painful, and experience something with no suffering at all. So awe for the Buddha's incredible spiritual faculties that was so well honed and so sharp that he could see things according to their nature. In doing so, uproot ignorance, and through doing that, actually destroy delusion, was destroyed in his mind. The darkness of delusion was exploded out of his mind with the light of mindfulness, concentration and wisdom, to the extent that it could never affect his mind again. It was liberated from greed, hatred and delusion. And so for myself, when I think of Lord Buddha's enlightenment, I feel grateful. And gratitude is a very beautiful emotion. And so when we recognize the value of something and we feel grateful towards it, even love the Buddha, not in a romantic way, not in an affectionate way, not in recognizing the conventional being that put the enormous effort into realizing that potential. For myself, I really love the Buddha's effort, the Buddha's spiritual faculties, the Buddha's wisdom, the Buddha's liberation. We allow the mind to love that. If it's going to love anything, love the Buddha's realization, love the Buddha's example, love the Buddha's qualities. It's very wholesome. Because we all love things, we all want to love. And it's like training ourselves to put this faculty to love somewhere where it's going to be most helpful to us. And so myself, I feel grateful towards, I feel in awe of the Buddha's realization, and I love the conventional Buddha. And in a way also that's a way of loving your ultimate potential. It's very important. So it's putting something else in the habitual way that we think. We're kind of often judging our minds, judging ourselves, wanting it to be different. There isn't much of a sense of blessing yourself or blessing this incredible potential that you have. So in loving Buddha, in loving Dhamma, in loving Sangha, in recognizing that your nature is Dhamma, and when you realize Dhamma, your liberation will be the same liberation as Buddha. It's training yourself to appreciate and recognize something incredibly valuable, wonderful, beautiful in your own mind. And so when you go to the Buddha for refuge, you're also going for refuge to your potential. The Buddha is not the statue. And the Buddha isn't even his 84,000 verses of Dhamma teaching. And the Buddha wasn't his body. And the Buddha is the being that realized ultimate truth, which is above, beyond, and better than all of those things. And so when you go for refuge to Buddha, you're going for refuge to your own incredible, extraordinary, and beautiful potential to be enlightened, and go completely beyond every type of suffering and experience unshakable peace, and then also be a refuge to others. If you realize that, you'll be able to help a lot of people. So if you don't mind, if you repeat after me. Buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. I go for refuge to the Buddha. Dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. I go for refuge to the Dhamma. Sanghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. I go for refuge to the Sangha. So I hadn't said much about the Sangha yet. Sangha is all of those wonderful beings that realized in the Buddha's footsteps what he realized. That's the monks and the nuns, the laymen and the lay women since the time of the Buddha. Lots of devas too. So this is yet another wonderful positive affirmation. It's not that the Buddha was this fluke, only he did it because he's some kind of superhero. Millions, we don't know how many. Maybe it's tens of millions, maybe it's hundreds of millions, maybe it was billions, I don't know. But we know it was a lot. A lot of people realized the liberation that the Buddha realized. And that affirms his liberation, all of their liberation, and your potential to be liberated by practicing Dhamma. And so when we go for refuge to the Sangha, once again, you're just affirming that this path, the Eightfold Path, practicing, realizing the Four Noble Truths, cultivating the Eightfold Path, Four Foundations of Mindfulness, this liberates beings. It's liberated millions of beings, and as long as beings continue to practice it, it will continue to liberate beings. So that a little bit more about the Dhamma, those practices, the Eightfold Path. These are descriptions of what we need to do in terms of cultivating mental faculties and developing insight. The Dhamma is realized. So the Dhamma isn't on one level. The Dhamma is 84,000 Dhamma verses, a bookcase full of teaching. In terms of what it really is, all of those teachings are pointing to, we understand that the Buddha gave these teachings to different individuals. Some of those people were enlightened after hearing one or two verses. It's not necessarily the case that you have to study hundreds and thousands of suttas. We understand that the Buddha had the miracle of teaching. He knew how to teach people in a way that they would understand, and many of those people understood quickly because their spiritual faculties were right because of previous Dhamma practice. So Dhamma practice is these simple lists, the 5 spiritual powers, faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration and wisdom, lead to the deathless, merge in the deathless. I love that list, it's so simple. And You have faith, you stimulate your faith, generate your faith, it gives rise to energy, appreciation, gratitude. The mind's very wholesome with those qualities, and then you apply that wholesome energy to being mindful of the object. Being mindful of the various objects, collectedness arises as more stillness, collectedness, spaciousness, concentration. And then you perceive things more accurately as they are, arising and ceasing, seeing that clearly. Sense of self drops away, and you experience not self. It isn't a self. I'm deludedly grasping at it as being a self, but when I see it very clearly, it's not. And seeing it clearly, it lets go. The mind lets go of it. You experience the mind without the self-construct, self-concept, self-grasping. So Dhamma, practice, is occurring in your mind, and Dhamma realization is occurring in your mind, and all of the teachings are pointing us there. Well, there's wonderful phrases in the sutras. It's within this fathom-long body that liberation occurs. That doesn't mean that liberation is going to occur in your bones or in your blood. What it means is that liberation occurs within the very space that your body is. It occurs in your mind, in the center of your body. So refuge in Dhamma, simple things, these mental faculties that become mental powers, faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration and wisdom, lead to the deathless, merge in the deathless. What does that mean? That means that these 5 things, when cultivated, will liberate you completely. Deathless means nibbana, a state that has transcended rebirth and death. And so going for refuge to the practice, going to refuge to your potential, and going to refuge to truth. And so we'll do it again another 2 times, hopefully with a little more understanding. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Go for refuge to the Buddha. Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi. I go for refuge to the Dhamma. Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. I go for refuge to the Sangha. And the last time we'll do it together. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Very good. So it's explained that a being in samsara has had to accumulate quite vast amounts of merit before meeting the 3 jewels. In a way, this is another positive affirmation, because so often, especially modern people, we judge our practice, we judge our life, we judge others. The modern world is a lot of critical thinking in the modern world. And it's good to become mindful of, be aware that there's already been a lot of practice done which was skillful. So you don't meet teachings about how to realize your most subtle nature and your ultimate potential if you haven't been extremely generous for many, many lives. And if you haven't developed a genuine, true, deep, loving appreciation of virtue, ethical conduct. So that's already accomplished. I like to mention to people, you already accomplished millions of wholesome, skillful, generous, kind deeds. And you already trained yourselves to behave morally, ethically, responsibly, skillfully, hundreds of lives, possibly thousands of lives. I really believe that, because you don't meet this teaching, you don't get this path of practice, you don't get these pointers about how to get liberated without a lot of auspicious supports. So unfortunately, if what Lord Buddha says is true, more beings in hell and more beings as ghosts than there are human beings, I have a terrible feeling it's true. So with that perspective, you understand that if you're deluded, you're ignorant, you don't know how to relate to these greedy thoughts, angry thoughts, and you act on them, that's what happens. We get frustrated. You try to find a way out of your frustration. if you try a bit more greed, a bit more aggression, a bit more anger, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. But that's what most people do. Your frustration gets to a certain point, and then you think, okay, it'll be through fulfilling a certain passion that I'll get a relief from my suffering, or expressing my irritation, anger, I'll get a relief from this suffering, and of course it makes it all worse. You can't see that very clearly when there's a lot of delusion in the mind. So a lot of beings, having made mistakes, not seeing things clearly, have found themselves in a much more difficult situation than the one we're in. And so we have compassion for that, but the point that I'm making here is recognizing that where you are is okay. In fact, where you are is very good in the samsaric perspective. Because I think human beings actually have quite a gift for feeling sorry for ourselves. And then if you recognize that you're very fortunate, it's definitely a workable situation, then you can drop the pain of feeling sorry for yourself and stop wasting energy as well. Waste a lot of time and energy feeling sorry for ourselves. And here we are in Melbourne, and I was told that Melbourne's the most livable city in the world, so what more could you possibly want? But I know that that could be very depressing, can't it? Here you are in the most livable city in the world and you still feel frustrated and depressed. And well, these things are always relative. One of the ways that the devas suffer is being jealous of each other. When you think about the suffering of devas, different types of suffering in different realms. So apparently they have these celestial mansions, and it's a bit like keeping up with the Joneses. It's like, how come his celestial mansion is more beautiful than mine? Samsara. The devas suffer as well. Teachings of the Buddha, he describes this himself. Teachings of the Buddha lead to heaven and beyond. So we're mostly interested in the beyond. But if you practice dana and you're being generous and you keep your ethical precepts and you meditate, it creates a lot of merit. And then the result of having created merit is you get born in places with more pleasure, more pleasant experience. So practice of Dhamma will lead you to heavenly rebirth, whether you want it or not. If you do it sincerely, that's where it leads. But I also encourage people to set the intention, especially at the time of death. I set the intention to be reborn, but you have to do it before you die. You have to kind of put in these imprints. People kind of get a bit, we want to grasp, we want a guaranteed good situation in the future. I think it's more about having the aspiration and the clear intention rather than the details. So I often tell people coming out of their meditation when the mind's peaceful to set the aspiration. At the time of death, may I be reborn in a place where I can practice Buddha Dhamma. And you don't need to worry about where it is. Just have that intention very deeply in the mind. At the breakup of the khandhas, the body and the mind, at the moment of death, may I be reborn where I meet the Buddha's teachings and can practice Buddha Dhamma. That's all you need. And then hopefully as you're dying, Buddho, 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 the breath will stop. You can't be mindful of the breath anymore. But what you can do is you can hold Buddho, synonym for mindful, aware, awake, and your refuge. Buddho, Buddho, Buddho. If you can hold on to that as you're dying, and you've already set your intention, it's a bit late then to be worrying about where you're going to be reborn, actually. The life that you've lived before you die is what's going to affect your rebirth more. The last thoughts are important. Tanajanana, I've asked him about this and he explained that two things are most important. The level that your mind has habitually been on throughout its life. So if you've been hanging out mostly in an animal realm, if you haven't been strict with your precepts and you've acted on passions and irritations compulsively, it's very difficult to get a human rebirth. If you've really tried to be ethical, maintain some virtue, practice some restraint, some patience, some forgiveness, incline the mind towards metta, compassion, then quite likely to be born as a human. But it's this making merit and then determining in a particular way See, the mind becomes like what it attends to, and the intention with which you do things affects the result. So many people making offerings in Thailand, modern day Thailand, and with the wish to be more rich. And so that's dangerous, because you can be reborn in a situation where you might well be rich, but you might not have virtuous friends or ethical friends, and you might use that situation to make a whole bunch of bad karma and go to hell after that. So be very careful. There's this noble wealth, Arya Sap, they say in Thai. Thanajanan talks about it a lot, that we aim to accumulate the noble wealth. That means your faith, thousands and millions of moments of mindfulness, collectedness, skillful types of collectedness, moments and periods of time where the mind is bright and full of merit. That's a noble wealth. That can go with you. And Ajahn explains, no flood, no fire, no storm, no famine can take that away from you, no war can take away the merit that you've accumulated. So that's what we need when we're dying. We need to have accumulated quite a lot of good karma and skillful habits, and set the intention, especially when we take days of practice like this, when we come out of a peaceful mind state. Okay, I recognize that practicing Buddha Dhamma is the most precious thing, most valuable thing. I don't want to get more deluded, I want to be less deluded, so may I practice in every life until I realize liberation, and at the time of death may I be reborn in a place where I can practice. So I don't know where that is, that if this world degenerates more and more, it might be a heaven realm. There might be certain heaven realms where devas are practicing Dhamma. Or it might be another human world where there could be a teaching, Buddha teaching right now in another world. Buddha describes samsara, or the universes, as ananta jagawan, unending, never-ending universe. So within that never-ending universe there are other worlds, other form worlds, other human worlds. So the condition that gives rise to human birth is having kept 5 precepts. And the condition of meeting the Buddha's teaching is having practiced Buddha's teaching. Not necessarily under previous Buddhas. It might be the case that in previous lives you were practicing sila in a different religion with a different name, but you were practicing what the Buddha taught, being generous, being ethical, being virtuous. And you might have practiced samatha, you practiced calming meditation. So practicing dana, sila and bhavana in enough lives that you finally meet the Buddha's teaching, and then he says on top of this dana, sila and bhavana you need to apply skillful reflection, wise contemplation. That was his insight when he was practicing the austerities in the cave. He realized that the extreme of patient endurance with painful feelings, racking feelings, wasn't leading onwards. He remembered the time that he had attained to a jhana under a rose apple tree as a young prince. And he realized, or he had the insight, or he wondered, could I combine a certain amount of collectedness, concentration, focus with wise contemplation? Is that the middle way? And he had the realization that it was. And then he wandered down, he had a bath. Sujata and her milkmaids offered him some milk rice. He was offered 8 bundles of kusa grass. He sat under the Bodhi tree. He made the resolution, I'm not getting up. Let my blood dry up. I'm not getting up until I get enlightened. Fortunately for us, he did. But what he did under that Bodhi tree was contemplate a certain amount of collectedness, and then he directed his contemplation. And actually, because of his incredible accumulated virtue, he was able to look at hundreds and thousands of past lives, and in seeing that he saw arising, ceasing, arising, ceasing, arising, ceasing, arising, ceasing, and he saw karma, being born in happy destinations due to having produced merit, being born in unhappy destinations having produced bad karma. He had inevitable insight. You imagine that you're really paying attention to it, and you really have the faculties to see birth, aging, death, birth, aging, death, birth, aging, death, birth, aging, death, with a very focused mind, not so focused that it's just delighting in an absorption in the bliss of samadhi, but focused with reflection and seeing. How could any one of those be a permanent self? The whole thing is changing, and is seeing it more and more clearly. And he saw that it was because of the ignorance as to the impermanent nature that there was grasping, clinging, upadana in Pali, attachment and clinging. And he also understood that it was because of grasping at the pleasure that was available in psychic existence, fed, nourished the next rebirth. But then with that incredible clarity he was able to see, but there's much more suffering than there is pleasure. And he was able to see it's not worth it. It's a bad deal. And then seeing the danger in samsara, seeing that grasping at the hope for pleasure meant that all this pain and aging and death and rebirth came again and again and again and again. He's like, this isn't worth it. Seeing that, letting go of the deluded attachment, seeing that it hurts, let go. He was able to let go. Seeing it clearly as impermanent, impermanent, impermanent. It's not self, it's dukkha, letting go. And then experiencing the mind which knows impermanence, knows dukkha, knows not self, but isn't a self. So that's sometimes referred to as the nibbana dhatu, enlightenment element, Buddha nature. So that's our potential. And the Buddha realized it through practicing his combination, the middle way, focused recollection, focused contemplation with a certain amount of concentration, investigating, seeing things clearly as they are, and being liberated through seeing things clearly as they are. So the other part of the ceremony that we usually do, of course, is taking these precepts. So we take them with understanding. These root defilements, greed, hatred and delusion, have to be weakened. Even if you understand the teachings, you have the methods, you know the teachers, if the power of greed and if the power of hatred is still powerful in your mind, it's not possible to realize. It's the weight of the kilesa kind of holding the mind down and binding the mind to samsara. So those things need to be weakened to a significant degree through this training. That's what makes it possible for the mind to be liberated. A large part of what makes it possible is having restrained ourselves from doing greedy things, angry things, hateful things, and then restraining ourselves from activities that increase and feed delusion. So that's what these precepts are for. It's not like some judgmental God saying, you're not allowed to have any fun. You can't do this and this and this and this, otherwise I'll punish you. I don't think any gods think like that anyway, by the way. It's a misinterpretation. As this talk about the going for refuge and taking precepts ceremony was quite a long one, I decided to split the talk into two separate ones. This brings us to the conclusion of the first part, going for refuge with deeper understanding. The second talk, pertaining to the taking of precepts and training with precepts, is titled Purifying Virtue with Deeper Understanding. Feel free to listen to that talk next if you have time.